sirens over Beirut, drone footage of burning infrastructure, a ceasefire, 10 days, standing between Lebanon and total collapse. Meanwhile, in the Red Sea, Houthi commanders are back at their launch consoles. And in Ukraine, over 700 drones scream through the night sky in a single barrage. The world is not cooling down. It is reloading. This is your global war breakdown. Let's get into it. Let's start where the most dangerous escalation corridor in the world currently sits, the Israel-Lebanon front. For weeks, Israeli air and ground forces have been conducting what can only be described as a relentless, grinding campaign against Hezbollah infrastructure across southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. But the operation that truly shocked military analysts and sent shockwaves through every capital from Washington to Tehran was what Israel called Operation Eternal Darkness. Reports indicate the single strike wave hit more than 100 Hezbollah targets in a compressed time frame. Power infrastructure, command nodes, weapons depots, tunnel networks. The name itself, Eternal Darkness, was deliberate, psychological. A signal not just to Hezbollah, but to Iran. We can turn the lights off. And the human toll has been devastating. Hundreds killed, according to open source analysis and Lebanese health ministry figures, with entire communities in the south displaced under rubble and smoke. Now, here is where it gets diplomatically complicated and critically important. Washington stepped in. And on the night of April 16th into the 17th, a 10-day ceasefire between Israel and the Lebanese state came into effect. 10 days, not a peace deal, not a framework. 10 days to breathe and negotiate. Lebanese and Israeli leaders are expected in Washington for follow-on talks, and there are signals that Pakistan, of all players, has publicly linked progress on Lebanon to its broader mediation role between the US and Iran. Let that sink in for a moment. Pakistan, positioning itself as a bridge between Washington and Tehran, tying the Lebanon file to the Iran nuclear and regional confrontation track. That is not a side story. That is a major geopolitical realignment happening in real time. But here's the fault line that could crack this ceasefire open. Israel has made its position absolutely clear. It does not accept external conditions that tie the Lebanon ceasefire to any broader Iran deal. Israel wants these tracks separated. Washington may want them bundled. And Tehran? Tehran wants maximum leverage on every single front simultaneously. 10 days. The clock is ticking. And what happens in those talks could determine whether this ceasefire holds or whether Lebanon becomes the ignition point for a regional war that pulls in Iran directly. Now, let's turn to Gaza, because the word ceasefire there has become almost meaningless on the ground. A US-backed agreement, formerly called the Comprehensive Plan to End the Gaza Conflict, was supposed to bring a durable halt to fighting in late 2025, and technically, that ceasefire still exists on paper. But according to UN data, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed since that ceasefire began. Let me be precise about what that means. People are dying during a ceasefire. Children, elderly civilians. In Gaza City, in Shati camp. Israeli strikes and armed group fire are both regularly breaking the terms of the agreement. The diplomatic architecture is there, just barely. A donor board of partners has pledged approximately $17 billion toward reconstruction. International stabilization forces are apparently being assembled. But here's the brutal reality check from open source analysis. $17 billion is a fraction of what independent economists estimate will be needed to rebuild Gaza. And while the donor conferences happen in comfortable conference rooms, the violence on the ground is actively destroying any trust that political implementation requires. There's a human dimension here that numbers alone cannot capture. Think about what it means to be a family in Shati camp, to have heard that a ceasefire was signed, to have allowed yourself just for a moment to believe it, and then to hear the strikes again. That psychological devastation compounds the physical one, and it feeds the very cycle of rage and recruitment that makes this conflict so extraordinarily difficult to end. The Gaza file is not closed. It is not even close to closed. Out in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, a threat that briefly appeared to be fading is now surging back. Yemen's Houthi movement, which spent much of 2024 and into 2025 conducting an unprecedented campaign of missile and drone attacks on commercial shipping, had gone relatively quiet as 2026 opened. But Houthi officials have now explicitly signaled a renewed phase of attacks, and they are directly tying this to US and Israeli strikes on Iran and the wider regional war. In other words, every Israeli strike on Iranian-linked targets, every American show of force in the region, becomes political fuel for Houthi commanders to point at and say, "This is why we fight." The mechanics of this threat are well understood by now. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, one-way attack drones, Western and regional naval task forces remain deployed, American, British, French vessels running intercept operations, but the cost arithmetic remains deeply unfavorable. Shooting down a drone or missile that costs tens of thousands of dollars with an interceptor that costs millions is not a sustainable equation. Not over months, not over years. If this renewed campaign reaches the intensity of the 2024-2025 period, global shipping insurance costs spike, cargo reroutes around the Cape of Good Hope, and supply chain pressure rises across Europe, Asia, and beyond. This is not just a military story, it is an economic one, and a geopolitical one, because the Houthis understand exactly how much pain they can inflict per dollar spent. Now, thousands of miles north and west, the war that has defined this decade continues grinding into its fifth year with no end in sight. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has entered what analysts are calling a phase of attritional entrenchment. Russia now claims full control of the Luhansk region, a significant territorial claim, though one that Ukrainian officials contest and independent verification remains difficult. What is not in dispute is the tempo of Russian strikes on Ukrainian military and energy infrastructure. Heavy, sustained, deliberate. And then there was the barrage that made headlines even in a war that has become almost normalized in Western news cycles. More than 700 drones in a single night targeting Ukraine's energy network. 700 in one day. Think about the logistics of that operation. The launch sites, the coordination, the sheer volume of munitions expended. It is an attempt to break Ukrainian civilian morale as much as military capacity, heading into a period when energy vulnerability is at its seasonal peak. Ukraine's response has evolved significantly. Kiev is increasingly relying on long-range drones and precision strikes, hitting Russian energy facilities, logistics nodes, supply depots deep behind the front lines. It is an attempt to impose reciprocal costs, to make the war economically painful for Russia at the source, not just at the front. President Zelensky floated the idea of an Easter truce, a humanitarian pause tied to the Orthodox calendar. Moscow dismissed it almost immediately as a public relations move, and to be analytically honest, the pattern of brief ceasefires in this war has been one of tactical repositioning on both sides, not genuine de-escalation. Daily shelling continues, missile attacks continue, the drone war continues, on both sides, every single day. The broader geopolitical dimension here is significant. NATO cohesion is under strain. Reports indicate disagreements at the alliance level over the Trump administration's approach to Russia. How much pressure to maintain, whether there is a negotiated off-ramp worth pursuing, and at what cost to Ukrainian sovereignty. Moscow, meanwhile, frames its campaign not as aggression, but as consolidation, a narrative aimed squarely at domestic Russian audiences and at fence-sitting governments across the global south. Neither side is close to a decisive military victory, but the war is reshaping everything around it. European defense spending, American strategic attention, global energy markets, and the very architecture of international security. So let's zoom out and look at what we are actually witnessing in April 2026. 4 major conflict zones, Lebanon, Gaza, the Red Sea, Ukraine, are not operating in isolation. They are interconnected by supply chains of weapons, by the ideological framework of what Iran calls the axis of resistance, by American strategic overstretch, and by the very real possibility that a miscalculation in any one of these theaters could cascade into the others. The Lebanon ceasefire lasts 10 days, if it holds. The Gaza ceasefire exists on paper while people are still dying. The Houthis are rearming and re-signaling. And in Ukraine, 700 drones flew in a single night, while the West debates how much longer it can sustain support. Here is the question that should be keeping every defense analyst and every world leader awake right now. What happens if the Lebanon talks fail, and Israel and Iran move toward direct confrontation, while Ukraine is simultaneously absorbing its heaviest strikes of the year? Is the West positioned to manage 2 major escalations at once? Is there enough political will, enough ammunition, enough diplomatic bandwidth to hold multiple fronts from crossing the threshold into something no one can walk back? We do not have that answer today, but in the next 10 days we may find out. Stay locked in, share this breakdown. And if the situation changes, we will be right back here to walk you through every development, every weapon system, every decision that matters. This has been your Global War Report. The situation is evolving. It always is.